Greetings, Earthlings! Welcome to our video series on physiological psychology, a branch of psychology that deals with the effects of normal and pathological physiological processes on mental life. In other words, this series is all about how our brains work to make us who we are. As research into the brain continues, we discover more and more about what parts of the brain do what and how all those various parts connect together. It's not simple. What we do, think, say, and feel comes from many different brain areas all working together. Somehow, these areas work in concert to make us who we are, but that doesn't mean that we are only a collection of nerve impulses. Who we are as people has something to do with the choices and decisions that we make in our lives. What we are exploring here is how our nerve cells and brain structures make those choices possible. Another aspect of modern brain science is that it teaches us about neurodiversity. That is, that everyone is different. Each brain is slightly different. We all have different talents and skills, and sometimes a set of characteristics that we think as normal might actually be quite uncommon. In the coming weeks, you will learn that one area of the brain can be doing something while another area simultaneously does something else. But it's important to remember that such simple descriptions are never the full story. Brains can change, established pathways can be interrupted and regrow using different cells. Some people are born with brains that do unusual things, and none of us is identical. But we are all marvelous. My name is Dex Kamitan, a PhD student and lecturer at the University of the Philippines, a psychology professor at the Manila Titana Colleges, and a big psychology nerd. And I will show you just how amazing our brains are. This video is the first of a two-part lesson on what the brain is. Today, we will talk about brain evolution and the elements of the brain. Next week, we will continue this lesson by talking about the thalamus and the limbic system. Lastly, this lesson will come full circle when we deal with the cerebrum and its functions. Now, what makes human beings special? People put forward any number of answers to that question. They have suggested that it's our ability to tell stories, to work together, to store information, to laugh, to imagine, to use language, to learn or to solve problems. It has even been suggested that we are distinct because we are not really distinct. Well, that's so meta, no? We don't have specialized horns, teeth, and other natural weapons or the ability to run fast. And although we can do a lot of physical things, there are almost always other animals that can do them better. Any or all of this might be true, but underlying them all is the one thing which makes it all possible: the very special brain that human beings have evolved, and the way that it allows us to interact with our worlds, our physical worlds, our social worlds, and our imaginary worlds. The brain is something very special, and it's what allows human beings to be what we are. Our brains allow us to see things and make sense of what we are doing. They allow us to take action, to move purposefully and do things when we need to or want to. They allow us to hear, to interpret vibrations in the air, to identify where they are coming from, and to identify their likely cause. They do the same for all of our senses, including the sense receptors that we have inside our bodies, which tell us what our muscles and joints are doing. Our brains make it possible for us to locate ourselves in the material world, to receive information from it, and to act within it. But they do much more than that. Our brains also allow us to remember things, and in more ways than one. They store conscious memories like PIN numbers and addresses, but they also allow us to remember things that happened in the past and even allow us to remember to do things in the future. Well, most of the time, that is. They allow us to store skills so that we can perform actions or cognition smoothly and without consciously thinking about the steps involved. And they store patterns and meaning so that we can make sense of new things that we encounter. They even allow us to imagine things that might happen in the future, and they allow us to recognize faces and bodies and to distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar individuals. Our brains are also make it possible for us to develop attachments and relationships that are basic to social living and to communicate with other people using words, signs, and symbols. At a more abstract level, our brains also also makes it possible for us to deal with the three R's, that is reading, writing, and arithmetic, each of which involves distinct areas of the brain. But being human is more than just having all these mental skills. It's in our ability to empathize with others, which really makes us very human. And our brains also provide us with the mechanism for self-knowledge, identification, and empathy. We have emotions too, and these are only possible because of how our brains have evolved. We feel anger, fear, happiness, and disgust. We feel pleasure and pain, and we respond to rewards. We have times when we are alert and agitated, times when we are relaxed and experiencing states like mindfulness, and times when we are asleep. These states of consciousness decide to sip a cup of coffee, to deciding to buy a house. The brain is an amazing structure, and in the coming weeks, we will be exploring all these aspects of how it works. And this begs the question, how do our brains become so complex? Now, we will be using this infographic posted by Scientific American to find out. Now, back in evolutionary history, the first animals didn't have brains at all. They were simple one-celled organisms, a bit like the amoeba of today, which floats in their liquid environment and absorb particles of food as they come across them. Now, as more complex animals developed, one of their advantages was that they became able to detect nearby sources of food. They began to develop specialized cells that could identify the chemical changes in their environment produced by nearby food, and other cells that would help them to propel their bodies towards it. They also developed a central linking system which allows them to use the information they were receiving and direct their movement accordingly. That central linking system acted as a coordinator between the incoming information and the resulting action. But we know it works because they still survive today. As animals became more complex, so did the structure of their nervous system. The front end of the neural tube began to become enlarged. It was the coordination center which received information from the detectors and the identified possible food or light or other information like vibrations, which implied that something large was nearby. Now, those detectors eventually became the sense organ. and the enlarged front part of the neural tube became the brain. The rest of the tube, which passed along the body, became the spinal cord, and the cells that passed information to and from it became the somatic or bodily nerves. Now, even though it became so much more elaborate, it was still a kind of tube. It just has many more knobby bits on the end than a flatworm has. Now, by the time by the time of the dinosaurs, animals had become very big, but one with different parts, which allowed it to coordinate the various bodily mechanisms needed to keep the animal alive, such as respiration, digestion, and heartbeat. The brain also received information from the senses, which had become much more sophisticated with their own separate organs and nerves and their own specialized parts of the brain. Movement and balance too had become vitally important functions, and a large part of the brain had developed to deal with these. And even a type of memory, although less complex than the memory we use, had begun to evolve. The dinosaur brain was tiny by comparison with our modern brain, but as paleontology shows, it worked, and it worked very well. Dinosaurs dominated the land for many millions of years, and their descendants, the birds, are still with us today. Now, the same brain developments applied to other animals like fish, amphibians, and reptiles. Their adaptation to different ecosystem and food sources led them to evolve into all sorts of different creatures. Some of those ecosystems encouraged them to develop a highly sophisticated sense of smell, so that the part of the brain related to it became very large too. Others Other required acute visions, which meant that the part of the brain dealing with vision became enlarged. Some animals developed an acute sensitivity to vibrations in the air, leading to an enlarged center for hearing and so on. Now, as animals evolved to deal with their environments, so the brain evolved to coordinate their adaptation. Now, another set of animals had appeared during the time of the dinosaurs, the mammals. This had evolved another special parts of their brain, which was able to control and regulate their body temperature. As a result, mammals could be active at night and avoid their reptile predators that depended on the sun for warmth and energy. Mammals evolved in other ways too. They began to suckle their infants and nurture them after they were born, which allowed the young animal a safe time to learn about the physical world around them and to explore this. A small part of the mammal's brain became specialized for adaptation and learning. So they were able to deal with unpredictable or changing environment. All this meant that when the world changed and the dinosaurs died out, the mammals were able to survive and take advantage of the ecological resources the dinosaurs were no longer using. So, some animals were vegetarian, living only on plants. Others were omnivores, exploiting whatever food source they could find. And most important of all, some of these lived socially and shared their resources. Now, since living socially was important, the demands of social interaction and cooperation meant that mammals lived in an ever-changing environment. So those parts of the brain that allowed them to deal with change and to communicate and pass on information became well developed. Animals living in social groups therefore develop multi-purpose brain, which could adapt to different environments, interact with different individuals, spot new opportunities, and deal with problems. And in one particular group of mammals, it became so important that it eventually overshadowed all other parts. When we look at a human brain today, almost all has expanded to spread all over the rest. And since it's the outer skin or cortex of the cerebrum, which does most of the work. The cerebrum has become folded and wrinkled so we can fit more surface area into the space. The human brain is one of the most remarkable things we know about, and understanding fully how it works is likely to keep our scientists busy for many generations to come. Now, in the coming weeks, we will be exploring what modern neuroscientists have been able to find out about the ways that the brain function. But even before we do that, we can learn a lot by looking at the different parts of the brain and seeing how each part has evolved. Let's begin by thinking about the most basic nerve functions a developing animal would need to be able to be able to be bit more sophisticated. Since then, of course, it's the spinal cord, the tube of nerve fibers running the length of the spine, linking our body's nerve fibers with the brain. Now, if we look at a cross section of the spinal cord, we can see that it really is a tube. It has a hollow in the middle, and it is filled with a nutrient fluid. Now, that hollow is surrounded by what we call gray matter, which is mostly made up of nerve cell bodies. And the gray matter is surrounded by white matter, which is nerve fibers carrying information to and from the brain. So the spinal cord is the main route for information going between the body and the brain. That is why people who experienced brain damage to their spinal cord can become paralyzed. Their brains may be trying to get their muscles to move, but they simply cannot get the instructions through. Now, not all movements is directed by the brain. The spinal cord also allows some of our reflexes, the rapid muscle movement that happens in a response to painful stimuli. This is what happens, for example, if you pull your hand away from a hot surface. You do it quickly without thinking, because the message of heat and pain only needs to go as far as the spinal cord. When it gets there, the message is instantly routed to the nerve cells, which tell your arm to move your hand away. Now, it doesn't need to go all the way up to the brain. That's known as a reflex, and because it's such a basic survival mechanism, it's controlled by the oldest part of the nervous system. Now, what happens is the message. Pain, for example, unexpected pressure, or whatever is picked up by the sensory nerve cells, which pass the information up the nerve cells in the spinal cord. From there, a message is immediately passed on to motor nerve cells, which connect to the muscles and instruct them to contract. So you pull your hand away or jerk your foot upwards, or respond in whichever way the reflex is appropriate. Now, the top of the spinal cord thickens out to begin to be part of the brain itself. The part where it's thickened, or the part where it thickens, is also known as the medulla. Um, and if we think about if we think about it as the next part of the nervous system to evolve, we can see how it too is concerned with basic functioning. The medulla is the part of the brain that regulates basic bodily functions such as breathing, swallowing, and pass nutrients around its body. But if that animal is to survive in an increasingly complex world, it also needs to be alert and ready to move if something threatens it. Moving upwards from the medulla, we find the brainstem becomes even thicker, turning into what is known as the midbrain, which is really a collection of several different parts. One of them is the reticular activating system, or RAS, which regulates different states of alertness: sleep, wakefulness, and attention. In humans and complex mammals, the RAS seems to be able to switch on large areas of the cerebral cortex, so we are alert and paying attention to what is around us. It has some sensory pathways and many connections with other areas of the brain. When we think about its evolutionary origins and how being alert would have helped an animal to survive in a dangerous world, we can see why this was quite an early part of the brain to evolve. Now, other areas of the midbrain include the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. Superior means above and inferior means below, which tells you how they are placed. Now, these are oval structures which do very basic sensory processing. The superior colliculi are particularly concerned with vision and touch, while the inferior colliculi are mainly specialized for hearing. They don't connect directly with the higher levels of the brain. Instead, they have a direct connection with our attention and moving system, alerting us immediately if there is, say, a sudden flash or bang. You can see how that would also have helped an animal to survive. As the brain evolved, animals were also becoming sophisticated. The pons is also involved in dreaming sleep in animals as well as in humans, and it is thought that this might have evolved to help the animal to form the neural pathways needed for smooth movements. When we see dogs dreaming, for example, it's evident that they are running or chasing something, which could possibly link with practicing physical skills. Now, the pons is connected to the cerebellum, which is the wrinkled bulge that sticks out underneath the back of the cerebrum. It's sometimes called the mini brain, and it's capable of carrying out many more complex functions than just keeping the animal alive. As we have seen, it plays an important role in skill learning. When we are first learning a new skill, our movements are often jerky and a bit clumsy, because we have to think about each movement consciously. But as we practice those movements, control of those sequences of actions move to the cerebellum, and those movements become smooth and automatic. So we don't have to think about doing them. The cerebellum doesn't plan deliberate movement that's done by the cerebrum, but it makes sure that our actions are coordinated, precise, and accurately timed. The cerebellum's functioning, the grooves and folds increase the total surface area. Now, the folds mean that its surface comprises most of its structure. but there are nerve fibers underneath them and a small space filled with fluid known as a ventricle at at the point where it joins the pons. Now, the cerebellum also controls balance, which is a function that appears to be located in a small knob between its two halves. Most drugs aiming to treat motion sickness have the effect of suppressing these areas of the brain. Now, in humans, the cerebellum is also included in some of the nerve pathways involving in processing attention, language, and fear and pleasure reactions. So you can see that it is an important part of the brain for all complex animals. Now, these structures collectively support essential body processes so we can understand why they would have evolved first. Now, this actually ends part one of our lesson. As a summary, the brain began as as an extension of a simple tube linking a primitive nervous system. It became increasingly complex as animals evolved. The part of the brain closest to the spinal cord deal with essential life-maintaining processes like breathing, heartbeat, digestion, and alertness. So, see you next week as we continue our discussion on the brain. My name is Dex Kamitan, and have a great day, everyone.